If we look at more of a broader picture, we can categorize water regimes and water availability into three different kinds of categories. And for those different kinds of categories, there are plants that are adapted to those different water availability conditions. Xerophytes are plants that are able to grow in very low water environments, and in very dry habitats throughout the United States, there is a way of landscaping that's known as xeriscaping. It's not zero like as in zero, it's zero as in dry, or a place where there's not a lot of water available. And so these xerophytes are plants that are able to tolerate low water conditions. On the other end of the extreme, we have plants that are adapted to high water conditions, or typically flooded water conditions all the time, and those plants are known as hydrophytes. And then we have everything else sort of in the middle. If you think about what most of our forests are like in Alabama, these are mesophytic conditions. So these are plants that are adapted to sort of a reliable but not too heavy amount of rainfall. So let's talk about all these different kinds of groups. Xerophytes, again, plants adapted to growing in dry environments, very dry soils. They can survive or recover from low leaf water potentials that would ordinarily kill regular plants or plants that we're typically used to that we would consider as mesophytes. So they have leaves that are able to dry out. They have very well developed root systems. They have sometimes the ability to store water. They have the physiological ability to have a lot of solutes within the leaves or within the cells of the plant that allow them to draw moisture from the soil where mesophytes would no longer be able to extract water from the soil. So they have a lot of very unique and effective adaptations. Just in this picture, you can imagine some of the other adaptations that we've talked about in the class so far. Some of the adaptations shown here are that the leaves are highly reduced down to little thorns, and most of the photosynthesis is done in the stems. These plants also have the ability to store water internally, and so when it does rain, they swell up a little bit with water and then are able to sort of meet that out during the rest of the season when it's much drier. There aren't really very many adaptations for shortage of CO2, but there's often adaptations for shortage of water, and since water and CO2 acquisition are coupled together, a lot of the adaptations for those two are linked physiologically and also morphologically in terms of conservation of water. The fundamental constraint is still getting enough CO2 even though it's abundant, but the fundamental constraint is actually getting enough CO2 but not losing too much water. So this is a cross-section of a xerophytic plant showing some of the physiological adaptations or the physical separations between the places where water vapor might be exchanged or where CO2 is exchanged, and the place where the products of photosynthesis are moved away from the rest of the plant. And these bundle sheath extensions are places where alternate forms of photosynthesis are conducted. Another adaptation that you can see here is that the stomata are at the bottom of this little pit. So this pit is actually not the stomata. This is not the stomata opening. There's a little pit down at the bottom. And so what happens here is whatever little moisture gets lost as the guard cells open up right here tends to stay within this little pit. CO2 can still diffuse readily into the stomata or through the stomata and then get taken into the leaf. So this morphological structure is coupled with the physiological structure here. And this morphological structure with trichomes on the inside sort of reduces the loss of water due to air movement along the surface of the leaf. Some other adaptations for low water conditions while still acquiring CO2. Some plants will have these long tube-like extensions where at the bottom of this tube-like extension of wax is where the stomata are. But the idea here again is to maintain sort of a medium moisture environment here where CO2 can still diffuse down these little tubes, get to the stomata and be pulled into the plant while minimizing water loss because of, say, wind or convection across the surface of the leaf. Other plants are succulents. They have the ability to store moisture within them, but also conduct CAM photosynthesis, CAM. So this CAM photosynthesis is a way of separating the photosynthetic process from the time when CO2 is actually acquired through the stomata of the leaves. And then finally we have some other plants that we've mentioned before, like orchids. Many of these epiphytic plants have the ability to physically store water within portions of their leaves. So in the middle we have plants that are mesophytes, and they're pretty drought intolerant. They don't store water because typically they're adapted to more of a competitive environment. Water is freely available, and it's not so much that you have to conserve it, but they can only tolerate these conditions of low water for a very short time. I wouldn't really say there's a lot of adaptations of mesophytes. It's just that they are sort of the middle of the road in terms of these extremes between xerophytes and hydrophytes. You might think that growing in a ready supply of water like a swamp like this is actually a good thing for plants, but it's not. Plant roots need oxygen as well. Plants, in order to function, need to have a regular metabolism that breaks down sugars, and in order to do that, they need access to oxygen. But because they get a much reduced supply of oxygen, these waterlogged soils keep plants from getting oxygen to their roots. That means that they're typically unable to continue growing when their roots are waterlogged. As a quick side note, most houseplants that people kill, they don't kill because of underwatering, they kill because they're watering them too much. And if they're watering them too much, what they're doing is they're basically starving that plant of access to oxygen because there's not enough air in the soil for the plants to be able to have a normal metabolic process. On top of that, toxic substances from anaerobic metabolism of bacteria around the soils will tend to accumulate in and around the roots, and the plants are not able to release enough waste products from metabolism. So growing in submerged soils is a real challenge for a lot of plants. Now there are a lot of plants that are adapted to this kind of environment, so what sort of adaptations do hydrophytes have? If they're purely growing in the water, like this plant is, some of the water lilies and things like that, if they're purely growing in the water, one of the adaptations is they have very little structural support tissue. They tend to be supported a lot by water, and so they can float on water. They can float because they've got a very poorly developed xylem system. They don't need it because moving water around is never a problem. Moving water in is never a problem. But instead, they have highly developed, very aerated tissues with these tissue types known as parenchyma. So here's an example, an SEM image showing a whole bunch of these air channels inside of a kind of a water lily. Some plants like bald cypress and swamp tupelo will have these knees, which are pneumatophores. These are parts of the root system, and the thought is that this allows the plant to be able to draw in oxygen so that the roots can undergo normal metabolic processes. So we've covered a few things with sort of water access and light access, and like I said before, these typically get coupled together. So let's look at a few different examples and think about how they might be adapted to one kind of environment or another. Let's take needle-like leaves of the pines that we have around here and throughout a good portion of the world. Needle-like leaves have reduced surface area. They are broken up into very small leaf sort of subunits, so they're highly divided. It's very easy for pine trees to lose energy, to lose excess heat through convection. Now pines typically don't lose a lot of water, And so they're well adapted to dry environments or water environment, or environments like in the southeast where the soils are kind of sandy and they don't hold water very well. And they can also do quite well in northern environments. These leaves, these little needles, don't tend to get lost very often. They don't lose a lot of moisture through evapotranspiration. So these plants are adapted to a wide range of relatively dry habitats. And if you think about a frozen northern tundra area, water may be present, but it's frozen in the ground. That sort of simulates drought conditions for pine trees. So that partially explains their adaptation in very northern environments. If we look at cacti, this is something that we've covered a few times. These leaves are reduced to thorns, so that again minimizes leaf area and water loss. What about a plant that's got abundant stomata? What sort of habitat might it live in? Well, abundant stomata is a place where water can be lost, but also CO2 can be gathered pretty readily. This is probably a plant that's growing in an environment that has ready access to water and reliable access to water. What about the moderate surface of waxy covering on this leaf? Well, if it's got a moderate level of waxy covering, it's probably a mesophyte. A pretty well competitive tree, one that's in pretty good growing conditions for lots of different species, neither a xerophyte nor a hydrophyte. Remember that a succulent plant is one that's going to be adapted to very dry environments or potentially very salty environments. Salty environments, as I'll talk about in a little bit, sort of mimic dry environments because a lot of solutes in the soil inhibit a plant's ability to be able to draw moisture up against that water potential gradient. A plant that has very dense pubescence probably occurs in a very sunny area and a place where there's not much moisture. What about this really large leaf? What do you think the water and the light conditions are like for this very large leaved plant, which is referred to as poor man's umbrella? Well, in this case, there's not very much light available. It's not a very warm environment. If it was a really warm environment, having a leaf that's that large means that plant's going to overheat pretty quickly. But you can imagine that it's got a pretty good access to water. If a leaf is going to be that big, it's probably not going to overheat too readily, and it should have a lot of water available. Real briefly, plants that are adapted to excessive salt areas, as I've mentioned, that saltiness doesn't allow a plant to draw up water very easily, and if the salt gets concentrated inside the tissues of the leaves because it's taking in salt water, it can be lethal to a lot of plants. Very few plants species are halophytes, in other words, adapted to coping with excessive salt. But some that are either sequester that salt in bladders inside of the leaves or have the ability to extrude extra amounts of salt from inside of the leaves. So they're taking up the salt, but they're also basically spitting it out at the same rate. Let's talk a little bit about soils now. It's important to point out that soil is in effect the same thing as dirt. The one difference, though, is that soil is kind of where we intend it to be. Dirt is something that is soil out of place. So if you have pants that have mud on them, you have dirt on them because you don't want the mud there. But if you're going to be taking that dirt and putting it into your garden, then it's soil. You want it there. Much like the differentiation between weed and plant. Weeds are plants that we don't want in a particular place, but they're still plants. It's all from a human standpoint. Fundamentally then, soil, or dirt, is composed of four major parts. There's organic matter, and that organic matter is dead material, partly decomposed material known as humus, and live things, bacteria, fungi, insects, other invertebrates, etc. Another component of soil is inorganic matter. This is the parental rock material, sand, silt, clay. Finally, there's going to be some moisture in there and also some air. Oddly enough, there is air in soil. Now, before we get into the nutrients of that are used by plants and the adaptations for gathering and storing those nutrients, I want to draw your attention to an experiment that maybe you've not heard of before. Back in the 1600s, a scientist named Johann Baptista von Helmont did this really cool, very elegant experiment. He wanted to know where plants got their mass from. And what he did was he planted a very small willow tree weighing about 2 kilograms, and he added 90 kilograms of soil in this pot. And he watered it, gave it nothing but water for the next 5 years. 5 years later, the final tree mass was 75 kilograms. It grew 73 kilograms in 5 years. But the final soil mass was only 89.4 kilograms. It lost a tiny fraction of the soil's mass. Where did all that mass come from? The point of this story is to say that plants do not eat soil. They do not eat soil nutrients. Their roots are not their mouth. They do not gain mass from the soil. There are important components in the soil, and clearly most plants cannot survive without those components in the soil, but they do not eat the soil. Instead, when a plant grows, all of its mass, or nearly all of its mass, is in captured CO2. That's made into cellulose, that's made into lignin, that's made into bark, that's made into stems, that's made into leaves or fruit. So that's all captured CO2 that's floating around in the air, and the plant is able to form that into all of these structures. That's some pretty cool chemistry. But you will never ever say, please, that plants eat soil through their mouths, which are their roots. Instead, what happens is the soil is broken down by erosion, and the plants take up tiny amounts of that soil, but they're not so much interested in the soil, they're more interested in the water that's in the soil. And these different soil types that get eroded that plants can then use vary quite a bit based on the parent rocks that are being eroded. So we've got plants down here on the toe slope of this hill. Most of the soil gets eroded down and gathers here, but that soil is going to be, remember, a mixture of those four components. There's going to be some broken down fundamental rock parent material, the clay, the sand, the silt, a little bit of organic material, and the water and the air. If you look at a cross section of a section of soil, you'll see several different zones. Now towards the top of this zone, or known as a horizon, is where the organic matter is at its richest. This humus layer contains a lot of organic material that's dead and decomposing plants, some insects, some invertebrates. This is where most of the nutrients of the soil tend to be captured. The horizon below that, as we go a little bit lower, there's less and less and less organic material, and there's much, much more dominance by weathering parent material. So a horizon of soil might only have a very thin layer of the most important aspects of soil that the plant needs, and as it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, there's less and less and less that a plant can get access to. There may be some water down here, but really for the most part, plants only root within this rooting zone. And all I want to do here is to point out in this very simple diagram, not the movement of CO2 and sunlight and everything, but what's happening down below ground. What's happening is the plant has this system of roots, and within the soil, especially in that organic layer, are three fundamental nutrients. So we're not talking about the water or oxygen for now. We're talking about the three most fundamental nutrients that limit plant growth. In other words, if there were more of these, plants would do better. If there's a shortage of these, plants will do poorly. And those three important nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Their chemical shorthands are N, P, and K. So you're going to want to remember that N, P, and K are the three most important elements, nutrients that plants use. If we look a little bit closer, the function of most of these leaf hairs is where most of the water and air and nutrient exchange happens. But what's happening with these leaves, with these roots, is they are both taking in water, but they're also pumping out. They're pumping out elements. They're pumping out ions, and the pumping and the moving of these ions allows charged particles like the sodium, potassium, and phosphorus to be taken up into the roots to be used throughout the rest of the plant. So let's talk about each of those nutrients in order, what they do for a plant and where they come from. The first one is nitrogen. And for nitrogen, the biological function is that they are involved in the transfer of genetic information and RNA, DNA. They're also large components of plant hormones, plant chemical defenses, etc. Most of this nitrogen comes from humus, the decomposed organic matter in that upper horizon of soil. And there are some plants that have adaptations for fixing atmospheric nitrogen in the form of N2, and through a mutualism with rhizobial bacteria, they have the ability to fix that atmospheric nitrogen and utilize that nitrogen for themselves. The next one is phosphorus. Biological functions of phosphorus are that they are involved in ADP and ATP and ADP energy transport, and in typical storage compounds. Phosphorus also forms the sugar phosphates that are part of the rails of nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And again, where it's found is in the decomposition of soil organic matter. So these two elements are especially common in decomposing soil. The last one, potassium, the K, is not really a major component of any plant structures or of any plant compounds, and so it seems weird to think of it as being something that's important for plants. But where potassium is especially important is as a molecule that gets used in sodium and potassium pumps and cellular movement of materials in basically all the processes of functioning plants, physiological processes, photosynthesis, protein synthesis, water regulation. So this is an element that might not comprise a real large component of plant tissue. In fact, it's a very small component of plant tissue. But it is used quite a bit for signaling and for plant physiology. And again, it comes from the decomposition of organic matter, and also the breakdown of a particular component of some soils, feldspar. So for everything, that organic layer is incredibly important. So what are some adaptations that plants have for low nutrient access? Well, I've already mentioned the adaptation of rhizobial bacteria, but plants also have mutualisms with fungi. It's thought that at least 90% of all plants have mycorrhizal associations that are between the plants and these fungi. The fungi get products of photosynthesis from the plants, and the fungi transfer elemental nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, other micronutrients to the plant. So these associations are adaptations. Some plants have carnivorous leaves, and usually these plants occur in habitats that are very low in access to nitrogen. So acidic environments like bogs and wetlands, places where nitrogen is in low supply, that's where you find much higher number of carnivorous plants. Evergreen leaves that we find in several plant species, especially as you go farther and farther south, are considered an adaptation for low nutrient environments because it costs a lot of elements in the production of making new leaves. So if you're a plant and you can hold on to those leaves for longer, you don't have to pay that cost of making new leaves every year.